Slavery in and of itself is not intrinsically evil.
Welcome to Mindshift, I'm Brandon, and I'm really excited about today's episode. This is a video where I'll be responding to a debate, specifically a Q&A section within a debate between Cosmic Skeptic, Alex O'Connor, and Trent Horn. I did a response video as well last Tuesday where we talked about if we have the right to judge God. That was a response to Mike Winger's video. I think that's what I'm going to do for Tuesday videos for the foreseeable future. Then on Thursdays, at least for the next 10 weeks, my plan is to bring over the 10 episodes I did on my previous channel. So last Thursday we did my deconversion story, and this Thursday we're going to be covering slavery. And on Sundays, we'll be doing our long format videos. So what is today's video about? Well, knowing that I'm bringing over my slavery video on Thursday, I wanted to do a little precursor to that video. The first question that Alex and Trent get in this debate is about slavery, and Trent's response, I think, is horrendous. So I thought it would be a good exercise for us just to watch this question, watch how he answers it, and kind of break this down step by step. To introduce both of these gentlemen to you, and then we'll watch the video and then we'll get into the breakdown. Alex O'Connor runs the YouTube channel Cosmic Skeptic. He has become hugely famous. He does a ton of debates, lots of activism, and I'm really impressed with his intellectual honesty, his ability to speak, and his ability to formulate his arguments and understand his opponents. Trent Horn also is one of my favorite apologists, if you can have a favorite apologist as an atheist, but I just mean that he is also fair. He really strives to understand the arguments. He listens with the intent of understanding, and he's very philosophically sound, as much as I believe someone can be before it breaks down into the other beliefs that they've given themselves over to. Trent is a Catholic, and he runs a radio show called Catholic Answers, where he helps people through their questions. He is also a professor of apologetics, and again has a really good grasp on the philosophical arguments as well as his doctrinal arguments. This debate mainly consisted of the two of them going back and forth on the problem of evil and suffering, so I'd recommend you watch the entire 2-hour debate. But the very first question is where we get our slavery question, and I'm going to go ahead and just play that for you right now.
Hi, awesome chat. Trent, I kind of have a question for you. So a lot of this talk seemed to be focused on, the types of loving God critiques from problem of evil, stuff like that. And so you mentioned that the intrinsic dignity of human beings is something that drives you towards an understanding of God as, something that exists, being loving and all those things. When you look at something like the classic Leviticus 25 Old Testament, you shall own slaves, you may take them from the lands around you.
Right.
When you see that piece of data, is that evidence against Christianity being the manifestation that God? It seems like that would be evidence against specifically the Christian claims.
Okay, so before we get to Trent's answer here, I just want to make sure you guys understand the question because some of it is based off the context of their conversation that happened ahead of time. A lot of what was talked about is objective morality. As this problem of evil was getting brought up and the suffering that we see in the world and things that happened in the Bible or that God allowed to happen or that God even condoned or endorsed, Trent kept saying to Alex, you don't get to say if this is right or wrong because you don't believe in objective morality. And Alex had a pretty good response. I wish he would have gone further with it, but it's similar to what I said in my video against Mike Winger. We do have the right to judge God, even if we don't believe in that objective morality that's given by him. If you're making the claim that your God is good and perfect and benevolent, then there shouldn't be these things we consider bad. And Trent's saying you can't consider them bad if you don't have that moral framework. And so it kind of went back and forth for a while. And one of Trent's points is that there is this intrinsic dignity to human life, this moral that is placed on the value of life that we get from God. And so the questioner here is saying, hey, if that's true, what about slavery, essentially? So let's see what Trent says.
It does depend a little bit on where I am in the timeline, so to speak, to evaluate the evidence. I would say, at least looking at it from my current perspective, I would say that Scripture is an account of God's revelation to human beings. And so that revelation is something of a progressive nature. Pope Benedict XVI talked about how in the Old Testament, there are things that were temporary and imperfect. So you had things like the toleration of legal slavery. You had things like allowing for divorce, for example, when Jesus later said, well, no, they're made to be man and woman to be one flesh. I find in the Old Testament, we see a lot of evils are tolerated, in many cases, to prevent greater evils. Aquinas said that divorce was tolerated in the Old Testament to prevent the greater evil of wife murder, for example. And Jesus says you have hard hearts, things like that.
My first issue is that we have this changing goalpost. He even says at the beginning, it depends on the time that we're talking about, but he references that the Old Testament has certain things that just had to be allowed by God because of the time and place that it was, and that we would see that change through Jesus. And he gives us the example of divorce. Moses says you can get divorced, and I guess that was to prevent people from murdering their wives. I really wish Alex would have interjected here and pushed back a little bit. And then in the New Testament, Jesus overrides that and he says, hey, listen, what God put together, let no man take apart. And so we have this new rule in the New Testament where Jesus comes and corrects what God couldn't do in the Old Testament. Now that's problematic for so many reasons. Is God so weak, so little, that he just had to put himself at the mercy of these people and of human nature, which he also created, by the way, and say, this is just the time, this is the context that these people are living in. Like, they're going to have slaves. The best I can do is give them some parameters around owning those slaves. Okay, so many issues, I just don't even know where to start. First of all, Jesus never came back in the New Testament and said anything against slavery like he did against divorce. So this is really falling flat to me. In fact, he went as far as to give commands in the New Testament to say, slaves, honor your masters, specifically your Christian masters. But if it doesn't get corrected in the New Testament, I'm not sure why we're alluding to this moving goalpost in the first place. And he chose his words very carefully there. He said, evils are tolerated. Now, I'm a parent, so let's just use a parental example, which is what God is supposed to be to us anyways, the good father. If I see my older son beating my younger daughter, I don't say, let him get that out of his system, because it could be worse. If he doesn't get this anger out, he might have to go kill someone. Would that be a justifiable excuse to let my daughter suffer this abuse? No. And that is the argument that Trent is making. Furthermore, that questioner brought up a very specific verse. And again, we'll get into this more in the slavery video, but there's two different slaveries. You have indentured servitude, which is how Israelite people were supposed to treat other Israelites. Then you had the slavery around from neighboring nations, and that is God giving express permission to go and capture people from other nations and own them for life. So a lot of apologists only focus on the indentured servitude and they twist it into, hey, listen, like there wasn't a lot of options, otherwise these people would starve to death. I think Trent's going to say something along those lines, and they excuse it, even though it's horrible. Because if you have a baby while you're indentured servant, guess what? Now that baby belongs to the slave master. If you get married during that time, which is the common practice, they would try to marry off these indentured individuals so that they would not leave after 7 years is how long they had to pay off their debt. So now they do become property for life if they want to keep their wife and children. Otherwise they can leave, but the slave owner still gets the wife and children. Like, it's absolutely disgusting. And that's the good version in the Bible of slavery. The verse this person brought up is about chattel slavery. Make no mistake. And Trent is saying that it is just tolerated. It is not. It is not only condoned, it is 100% endorsed. God is giving his permission. He is the one coming up with the plan here. He is not simply tolerating. It's just disgusting. Let's see where he goes from here.
The question of slavery is a complex one. I have 2 chapters on it in my book, Hard Sayings, A Catholic Approach to Answering Bible Difficulties. But I will say there that slavery in and of itself is not intrinsically evil, depending on how you define it. So if you define slavery as compelling someone to work and not paying them and not allowing them to leave, well, we do that sometimes with convicts in prison. We make them pick up trash along the highway and they can't leave and we don't pay them. Technically, that's slavery, but it's just.
Technically, that's slavery, but it's just, and not all slavery is necessarily evil. I think he's playing with semantics here, and I think he's making an unfair comparison. Now, I think we have a non-perfect justice system. I think that I have some qualms about the work being done by inmates. And in state to state, it differs about if they get paid and how much they get paid. But even the ones who get paid do not get minimum wage. But they have lost certain rights, that's for sure. Lots of people lose rights for lots of different reasons, and it doesn't equate slavery. Inmates can't vote either. Does that mean that they are slaves because they don't participate in all the rights of the society around them? No. Also, this would be maybe, and still probably not, some kind of an excuse if you were talking about the indentured servitude. But again, the verse was referencing the chattel slavery that's happening from the nations around Israel. So if we're furthering that for what it really is, that's like us going to Africa and saying, hey, even though you live over here and we don't know you, you probably broke our laws that we've set up for our society. So we're going to take you against your will, bring you to America to put you in jail, which is a just form of slavery. It doesn't make any sense at all. See where he goes next.
It's a due punishment for what has occurred.
A due punishment for what has occurred. What did And again, there's so many more examples than the transatlantic slaves going on in the world still today and in history and what was going on with the Israelites and their enemies. But the idea that Trent is just saying that this is a form of justice is what is really, really disgusting. And there are people out there who would argue, okay, listen, those neighboring tribes, they worship the wrong God. That's the crime. They're anti-Yahweh. So just like you put people in jail for murder, the Israelites, being the chosen people, had every right to put people in jail for the crime of worshiping the wrong God. And if you can make that excuse, if just because you serve the right God and someone else is born in a different part of the world that has no idea who this God even is, that they are immediately condemned to a life of slavery as just punishment, I think you're the one with morality issues.
Now, I think in many cases throughout human history, slavery was unjust, like the transatlantic slave trade, for example.
So he just said it. The transatlantic slave was unjust. That is exactly to a T what the Israelites were doing. They're not taking from within their own country. They're going to a different country or tribe or people group or ethnic group, etc. They're going outside of their own area to take people and make them slaves as property. It's the exact same thing. How can anyone excuse that? It's like they just do the same thing. Every single apologist does the same thing. They hear the verse in Leviticus that is definitely not about indentured servitude, and then they say, let's talk about indentured servitude. It's cheap.
It describes people who are stricken with famine saying, please save us from this famine. We shall sell ourselves in slavery to you. Because remember, in the ancient world, there was no lines of credit. For many people in the ancient world, you had an alternative between starvation or perpetual servitude, and many would choose servitude.
Okay, I'm trying not to stop it too much, but it's a little ridiculous here. This is another excuse I hear about when people take sexual slaves, which happened in the Bible. So kill all the men, kill all the children, but if there is a woman who is not yet known or slept with a man, meaning a virgin, you can take her for your booty, your prize. I wonder what those Israelite men were going to do with those virgins. Why do you think they kept them alive? Oh, but Brandon, they made wives out of them. So what? It's absolutely disgusting. These are sexual slaves that were taken, and the argument literally given by Christians who've tried to tackle this is, hey, listen, war happens. It's not war, it's genocide, by the way, but war happens, and these women, if they were just left alive with no men to support them and no means, would starve to death. They'd have this horrible existence. So the Israelite men taking these women in as their own and marrying them is God's sovereignty. That's gross. He's making a similar point here. And again, he's only addressing the servitude aspect. Yes, were there Israelites in the Israelite community that ran out of money and were going to starve? And so they said, hey, because I have no other option and you guys are into this thing, let me come work for you for 7 years. And that would almost be okay if it was a work contract. But the things that were allowed to happen to these individuals, you could beat your indentured servants as long as they got up the next day. You could totally mess them up as long as you didn't dismember their body. You could rape them. You could force them to do anything you wanted to. Very, very few rules, and you got to do that for 7 years. And then there's all of the horrible law bending that happened to actually make them slaves forever by forcing them to marry or letting them have children, etc. So acting like they had no other choice and there's no form of debt and blah, 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 and this is just what people did to an extent, but again, it's only within the Israelite community. It's not just in any capacity, and it has nothing to do with the topic that was brought up.
I would say then that the Bible takes human beings in their broken condition, and God progressively reveals himself and leads them to moral perfection. And so we see this with slavery, we see this with other evils, and God ultimately leads us. He leads people into the greater awareness of human dignity. So that even in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, it says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And the slave laws in the Old Testament were actually, they treated, in many respects, those who were in servitude were treated more humanely than those in other corresponding areas.
I don't know what he's trying to prove here. First of all, he's saying that God will morally perfect you throughout time. Well, these individuals that died slaves and the masters who died masters, there's no moral perfection coming for them. Oh, but Jesus will take care of in the New Testament. This is all pre-Jesus, where Jesus didn't show a change in heart for the slave, like we've already covered. And now he's going back, and I'm not sure what point he's trying to make, but he's saying, hey, look, even in Leviticus, it talks about loving your neighbor. Loving your neighbor in Leviticus meant loving your fellow Israelite, and really an Israelite in good standing, which these indentured servitudes were not. It's a different word than the neighbor used from neighboring nations, meaning those around you that are not Israelites, where you get your chattel slaves from. And he's right. There are slave laws that say to treat your Israelite slave better than your foreign slave, thus the indentured servitude versus property ownership that you can pass down to your children. How much you can beat them, do whatever you want. This is slightly better. Like if I had to choose between the two, I would choose the 7 years of indentured servitude versus being captured, having my entire family killed, and then coming to be property forever. Yes, this does not show me God's moral perfecting through the ages.
But to understand the human dignity, then when Jesus says you shall love your neighbor as yourself, he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. He provides a greater enlightening of human dignity, whereas in Leviticus, it says in Leviticus, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, but neighbor meant fellow Jew. But then Jesus shines more light in this progressive relation to say you shall love your neighbor as yourself, and neighbor is every other human being.
Okay. I want to look that up. I understand, I guess, a little more what he's trying to say. He's saying, look at, again, just like the Moses divorce example to Jesus example. In the Old Testament, Leviticus, neighbor did mean fellow Jew, like we just talked about. And in the New Testament, Jesus expands neighbor to everyone. I don't think that's true, but I don't know enough to argue it. My understanding is that when Jesus is saying these things like love your neighbor as yourself and turn the other cheek, and these things that look like a reframing of eye for an eye in the Old Testament, he's talking to the Jews about the Jews. If you don't turn the other cheek with your fellow Jew, it can cause infighting. And hey, we're trying to do something here. Jesus was a zealot leading a rebellion. That is the historical accuracy of Jesus. That's the context that I think makes the most sense. And there's a lot of wonderful books that I can link in the comment down below that talk about this. Bart Ehrman is one, Reza Aslan is another, who have helped understand that if Jesus said these things, this is the context he was speaking in. But let's just give this one to Trent. Let's allow that, hey, in the Old Testament, this was the case, and in the New Testament, Jesus made it slightly better. First of all, for this to hold up, it would have been great if Jesus just said, hey, guys, don't own slaves. Pretty simple comment. He didn't do it. He spent a lot of time talking about hell and money and heaven and himself, and not so much time correcting and perfecting the Old Testament. And furthermore, I just want to understand. Let's use the Bible and let's take a literal example and say people have been around for 6,000 to 10,000 years. There are Christians who obviously believe in evolution and who believe that we have evolved over the actual correct time span. But take either one. When did God decide that people were going to be worthwhile enough to get to this end result? I wouldn't say that our world is morally perfect now, and we're 2,000 years post Jesus. Why not just start with this moral perfection? Why are we working our way through it? And again, I could almost get on board if he meant what he said, if this was just about allowing humans to run their course. But God did intervene. God spoke directly to this one people group and gave them express permission and endorsement to own slaves. Like, none of this matters. None of this means anything.
I do not believe the Bible contradicts human dignity, but it does reveal a progressive understanding of it to human beings and their moral conduct, things like that. But I think that is the fair question you ask, and I apologize if I can't give a more thorough response to it, but I don't see that as an ultimate conflict.
For sure. Thanks. Just have a really, really quick follow-up to that. So given kind of the status of the Old Testament and the New Testament, do you think there's anything that could have been in the Old Testament that would be evidence against God from the perspective of human dignity? Like, is there something that could have been in the Old Testament being commanded that wouldn't be able to explain in the same way that you explain slavery?
This is a fun little sneaky question, I think. He's saying, hey, okay, you don't have a problem with slavery. It's essentially what he's saying. Like, we have a clear example of chattel slavery and you have talked your way out of it. Is there anything that could have been in the Bible that you would have been like, you know what? That's morally apprehensible. And the first thing that came to my mind when I was listening to this was like child murder. And then I thought, oh no, the Old Testament is littered with that. And Trent is still a Catholic, so he's obviously fine with that. So what can you think of, hypothetically? And again, I thought of a lot of different things, not just child murder, but also sexual slavery, endorsed and condoned rape, genocide, abortion as punishment, murdering people who don't agree with you, and the list goes on. But there's, like, if you just asked anyone in general, if they weren't knowing they had to defend their Bible, like, hey, what's something abhorrent that's inexcusable? You would say like slavery and child murder and all of this kind of stuff. And so he's just saying like, well, what would convince you that your God's not a good God? But let's let them talk it out here.
It's always hard to answer a hypothetical question. Like, could there have been X that would count against something being divine? I suppose if there were something in the Old Testament that said explicitly not to believe something that would later come to be revealed in the New Testament, that would be very contradictory and difficult to reconcile. But that would be the first example off the top of my head. So
cool. Thanks.
So very nice questioner. He's not pushing back. I can't believe that Alex did not intervene here. I would not have been able to keep my mouth shut, but he's respecting the Q&A process, I guess. So, I mean, final thoughts on this, what he's saying there is no, there's nothing in there that's problematic to me. And the only thing I can think that could be problematic because it doesn't exist, according to him, is if the Old Testament said something that was clearly rejected in the New Testament, which I'm a little confused about because it sounded like that was kind of what he was alluding to with divorce and things of this nature, that God did change his mind, that God did create for new allowances. And his term for this is that moral perfecting, which is a really pretty term to just say that things got minimally better. And if you think about the time frame from when, say, Leviticus was first written to when we get the accounting of the Gospels, hundreds of years depending on what you want to believe, it's a long time for civilization to morally progress, especially when you have some great thought leaders like the historical Jesus may or may not have been. We've had those people in history in a secular sense as well. And we've had just a natural moral progression as time has gone on. If we look at the time of Jesus until now, there are many things that have gotten better. There are some things that have gotten worse. And the Christians are like, oh, the world is worse than it's ever been, which is not true. This is the most peaceful time in history, literally. Statistically, in terms of war and disease, death and famine and poverty, this is the greatest time in the history of the world. This is not imminent Armageddon times. We have generally progressed, and there wasn't another newer testament that helped us do it. It just happened organically through the evolution of man and societies having to get better at co-aligning or self-destructing. One thing that I do respect that Trent has said is if your answer to the problem of evil or slavery, etc., is quick and easy, you probably haven't thought through it very well. And I think that's fair. I think there's a lot of Christians who are like, oh, there's no problem with evil. Evil had to happen because God had to give us free will. And they just think that that's sufficient. Like, at least Trent recognizes and has ideally maybe grappled with this to a larger extent and still come out on his opinion that these things are excusable and there is something at work here. And so that's almost respectable, but in my opinion, still is just completely missing the mark here. I think it's really easy to look back and say like, oh, this is God at work. He had to leave us to our own devices, but he didn't leave us to our own devices. This Old Testament is filled with interjection from God, divine revealing as opposed to divine hiddenness, literally leading his people visually by fire at night and a cloud of himself during the day, meeting with the patriarchs on top of mountains in personal ways, showing up doing huge miracles for people to witness. That is all completely eroding this free will that supposedly he gave us. And when you tell your chosen people to go to this specific tribe, kill everyone, capture these people, and rape these people, you have infringed on the free will of that people group. I don't understand how people like Trent can't just put themselves in that position. Why can't we sympathize with these people that went through these things? They were not enemies of God. They were just people born in a different latitude and longitude than the Israelites. That was their crime, and their punishment was absurd. And God didn't tolerate it, he commanded it. So that's it for today. Stay tuned for the Thursday video where we talk about slavery at large and we break down all of the verses. We'll get into the Bible, we'll talk about the differences, we'll talk about a lot more of the other apologetic arguments against it and try to dismantle those. This is probably my number one issue with the Bible. This, I think, is the thing that is the hardest for anyone to explain. Thanks for being here. Really appreciate all the support on the new channel. I have so many good videos lined up for you guys. Stay tuned, turn on notifications. Thanks again, have a wonderful day, and keep thinking.